Old copper and wet pine taint every breath near this chopping block. An executioner's axe rests against it, heavy iron waiting for bone. She stares at frost clinging to splintered wood. Above her stands King Alistair, an alpha knowing nothing of mercy. He ordered this death. He watched royal guards drag her through freezing mud. What he doesn't know, what she swore to take to her grave, is that his only heir currently rests safely beneath her ribs. Rowena's breath plumed in the freezing air of the dungeon, thin white clouds that vanished against the damp black stone. Oakhaven's Hold was a miserable place to die. It wasn't a romanticized oubliette where prisoners languished in tragic beauty. It was a hole. A jagged hollow carved directly into the bedrock, beneath the keep smelling perpetually of ammonia-rotting straw and the metallic tang of fear sweat. Water dripped somewhere in the dark, a slow, torturous rhythm that measured the final hours of her life. She sat on the floor ignoring the crude wooden bench in the corner. The stones were freezing, leaching the warmth from her thin linen tunic, but the cold kept her awake. It kept her sharp. She rubbed a dirt-stained hand over her flat stomach. The movement was instinctive, a subconscious guarding of a secret that hadn't even begun to show. 9 weeks. That was all it took to alter the course of history, to plant a seed of royal blood in the womb of a woman currently condemned to die for high treason. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the corridor. Heavy booted, armor clinking with a dull, rhythmic scrape. The guards were coming. Rowena didn't cry. She had shed her tears 2 nights ago when the verdict was delivered. She had been a scribe, a low-ranking record-keeper in the castle's massive library, invisible and insignificant. That invisibility had allowed her to slip into the king's chambers when the assassin's blade had left him bleeding and delirious. She had bound his wounds when his own guards were busy chasing shadows. She had stayed. He had pulled her into the fevered dark of his bed, a collision of desperation and primal need, and then she had been framed. Lord Kendrick, the king's most trusted advisor, had found the real culprit, but needed a scapegoat to cover his own tracks. Who better than the invisible scribe, a few forged letters bearing the seal of the rival Moonridge pack, a vial of refined wolfsbane planted beneath her mattress, and the trap was sprung. The heavy iron door groaned its hinges, screaming in protest as a guard yanked it open. The torchlight spilled in blindingly bright after days of absolute darkness. "On your feet, traitor!" A harsh voice barked. It was Brannock, one of the beta guards. He wasn't a bad man, just a loyal one. To him she was a poisoner who had tried to murder their alpha. The hatred in his eyes was genuine. Rowena pushed herself up. Her joints popped stiff from the cold. She didn't offer her hands for the shackles. She simply held them out, wrists pressed together. Brannock paused, a flicker of surprise crossing his rough features, before he clamped the heavy iron cuffs over her skin. The metal bit into her wrists. He locked them with a heavy iron key, the click echoing in the confined space. "The king is waiting," Brannock said, his voice flat. "I wouldn't want to keep him—" Rowena replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. They marched her out of the cell. 2 guards in front, 2 behind. A procession fit for a monster. The ascent from the dungeons was a climb through purgatory, up the winding, uneven stone steps past the armory smelling of oil and leather, up into the lower halls where the servants stopped to stare. Their faces were masks of disgust. Some spat on the stone floor as she passed. Rowena kept her eyes forward. She focused on the rough weave of Brannock's cloak in front of her. If she looked at the servants, if she saw the baker who used to slip her warm rolls in the morning, or the seamstress who had helped mend her winter coat, she would break. They reached the heavy oak doors that led to the central courtyard. The air that hit her face was a physical blow. It was the dead of winter. The wind howled through the battlements of Oakhaven, carrying the scent of impending snow and the sharp, clean bite of frost. The courtyard was packed. The entire pack had gathered to watch the traitor hang or burn or lose her head. They were silent. Not out of respect, but out of an oppressive, heavy anticipation. The silence of predators waiting for the kill. Rowena stepped out into the light, her bare feet numb against the frozen cobblestones. She looked up. There, standing on the raised wooden dais, was King Alistair. He looked like a statue carved from granite and ice. Alistair Alpha King of the Western Reaches did not sit on a throne for executions. He stood. He bore the weight of his judgments on his own 2 feet. He wore dark leathers and a heavy fur mantle that settled over his broad shoulders like a storm cloud. His dark hair was pulled back, exposing the sharp, unforgiving lines of his jaw and the jagged scar that traced down the side of his neck, the very scar she had stitched together in the dark. His eyes, a piercing, unnatural shade of amber, locked onto hers the moment she stepped through the doors. There was no recognition in them. No memory of the girl who had held a damp cloth to his forehead, no memory of the desperate whispers they had shared when he thought he was dying. He only saw the forged letters. He only saw the wolfsbane. He only saw the threat to his pack. To him, she was just a face among hundreds, a nameless casualty in the brutal game of medieval pack politics. Next to him stood Lord Kendrick, wrapped in expensive velvet looking suitably grave. But Rowena could see the microscopic tightening of Kendrick's lips, the suppressed smirk of a man who had won. In the center of the courtyard sat the block. It was a massive scarred stump of ironwood, darkened by years of blood that no amount of scrubbing could wash away. Beside it stood Gregor, the executioner, leaning on a long-handled broadaxe. He wore no hood. Packs didn't hide from death. They looked it in the eye. The guards shoved Rowena forward. She stumbled, her frozen feet clumsy on the uneven stones, but she caught herself before she fell. She would not crawl to her death. Rowena of the lower ward. A herald called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "You have been found guilty of high treason, of conspiring with the Moonridge Pack, of attempting to assassinate the Alpha King with wolfsbane." The crowd rumbled a low, collective growl that vibrated in the soles of Rowena's feet. It was a terrifying sound, the primal fury of 100 wolves. The sentence, the herald continued unbothered by the noise, is death by the axe. Rowena reached the block. The wind whipped her thin linen tunic around her legs. She was shivering violently now, her body betraying the calm she tried to project. She looked at Alistair. He was staring at her, his expression entirely unreadable. "Look at me," she thought fiercely. "Look closely, see what you are throwing away." But she said nothing. Pleading would do no good. She had tried to defend herself during the brief, farcical trial, but her words were nothing against Kendrick's evidence. Furthermore, she could not tell Alistair about the child. If Kendrick knew she carried an heir, she wouldn't have made it to the execution block. She would have had a tragic accident in her cell. The child would have been a threat to Kendrick's influence over the king. Better to die quickly here than to be tortured for information in the dark. "Kneel," Brannock said, his voice softer than before, almost pitying. Rowena dropped to her knees. The stone was biting cold. She looked at the blood-stained wood of the block. It smelled foul. "Place your head upon the block," Gregor rumbled. She leaned forward, resting her cheek against the freezing, scarred wood. The roughness scraped her skin. Out of the corner of her eye she could see Alistair's boots on the dais. Alistair raised his hand. The signal. Gregor shifted his weight. The heavy iron rings on his leather braces clinked. He raised the massive broadaxe high into the air. The grey winter light caught the honed edge of the steel. Rowena closed her eyes. She focused all her energy inward, pulling her awareness away from the cold, away from the crowd, away from the man who was killing her. She focused on the tiny, fragile spark of life deep within her. "I'm sorry," she whispered in her mind. "I'm so sorry." Panic, raw and biological, spiked in her blood. Her wolf suppressed and dormant from the cold, and starvation flared in a final, desperate surge of survival instinct. It wasn't a physical shift, she was too weak for that, but a hormonal explosion. The primal distress signal of a pregnant female facing imminent death. On the dais 20 feet away, Alistair's nostrils flared. The wind had shifted. A sharp, freezing gust blew directly from the execution block toward the raised platform. It carried the stench of the dungeon, the smell of fear, and the metallic tang of the frozen courtyard. But beneath it all, buried under layers of dirt and despair, Alistair caught something else. It was faint. Impossibly faint. A scent so delicate it barely registered over the smell of the damp wool worn by the crowd, pine needles, crushed rain, and a deep resonant undertone of himself. It was the scent of his own bloodline, the unique, unmistakable pheromone of a royal pup. Alistair froze, his amber eyes widened, pupils dilating until his eyes were almost entirely black. The world seemed to slow down to a crawl. The roar of the wind faded into a dull hum. He looked at the block. He looked at the frail, shivering woman with her neck exposed to the steel. Gregor's muscles bunched. The axe began its downward arc. Stop! The roar tore from Alistair's throat with such concussive force that several people in the front row flinched. It wasn't a human shout. It was an alpha command laced with a terrifying dominance that forced every wolf in the courtyard to instantly submit. Gregor tried to halt his swing. The momentum of the heavy axe was tremendous. He twisted his torso violently, wrenching the handle to the side. The blade slammed into the ironwood block, burying itself 3 inches deep into the wood, less than a hand's breadth from Rowena's nose. The sharp crack of the impact echoed like a gunshot. Rowena gasped, her eyes flying open. Splinters of wood showered over her face. She didn't move. She couldn't. Complete, absolute silence fell over the courtyard. Alistair didn't take the stairs down from the dais. He vaulted over the wooden railing landing on the cobblestones with a heavy thud that cracked the ice beneath his boots. He moved with terrifying speed, a blur of dark leather and predatory intent. The guards flanking the execution block scrambled backward, desperate to get out of his way. "Sire." Lord Kendrick called out from the dais, his carefully constructed mask slipping into genuine alarm. "What is the meaning of this? The execution?" "Shut your mouth, Kendrick." Alistair snarled, not even looking back. He reached the block in seconds. He grabbed the handle of the axe still embedded in the wood near Rowena's head and wrenched it free with one brutal pull, tossing the heavy weapon aside as if it weighed nothing. It clattered against the stones, the sound deafening in the quiet courtyard. Rowena slowly pushed herself up from the block. Her whole body was shaking, tremors racking her spine. She looked at Alistair, expecting to see madness, expecting him to finish the job with his bare hands. Instead, he dropped to one knee on the freezing stones right in front of her. He didn't care about the mud. He didn't care about the hundreds of eyes watching them. He reached out his large, scarred hands hovering over her shoulders, hesitating as if he were afraid she might shatter. He leaned in close. His face was inches from hers. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin, smell the sharp, clean scent of ozone and winter forest that always clung to him. He took a deep breath, inhaling the air right at the crook of her neck. Rowena stiffened, turning her face away. "Don't!" she rasped. Alistair exhaled a ragged, shuddering breath. His eyes, when they met hers again, were completely wild. The cold, cynical king was gone. In his place was a beast that had just found its most prized possession on the edge of a cliff. "You—" His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and fractured. "You carry my child." It wasn't a question. Rowena stared at him. The urge to deny it, to spit in his face, rose in her throat like bile. He had locked her in the dark. He had ordered her head chopped off. But the exhaustion was too deep, the cold, too absolute. "I carry nothing for you," she said, her voice flat and hollow. "You just tried to kill us." Alistair flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down at her wrists, shackled in heavy iron raw and bleeding from the chafing. He looked at her thin, filthy clothes and the hollows of her cheeks. A low, menacing growl began to build in his chest. It wasn't directed at her. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated self-loathing mixed with a violent protectiveness that made the air around them feel thick. He reached out and closed his hands around the heavy chain linking her iron cuffs. He didn't call for the key. He simply gripped the iron, his muscles bulging beneath his leather tunic, and pulled. The metal groaned. The links warped, and with a sharp snap, the chain broke. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Alistair didn't stop. He grabbed the cuffs themselves, hooking his fingers under the iron bands, uncaring as the sharp edges cut into his own skin. With a brutal wrench, he bent the locks until they gave way, dropping the heavy metal to the stones. Rowena rubbed her bleeding wrists, staring at him in shock. Alistair, Lord Kendrick's voice was shrill, now panic bleeding through. He hurried down the stairs of the dais. "My king, you cannot halt an execution of a convicted traitor. The law demands—" Alistair stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He turned his back on Rowena, placing himself squarely between her and the rest of the pack. "The law," Alistair said, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the keep, "demands that I protect my pack, and it demands that I protect my blood." He pointed a finger at Kendrick. "She is carrying my heir." Pandemonium erupted. The crowd broke into chaotic murmurs, shouts of disbelief and gasps of shock. An heir, the king, had no mate. He had rebuffed every political marriage proposed to him. To hear that a traitor, a common scribe, was carrying the future of the Western Reaches was incomprehensible. Kendrick stopped dead in his tracks, his face draining of colour. That is a lie, my king. A desperate trick by a woman facing the axe. She is a poisoner. She works for the Moonridge pack. "Are you calling my senses into question, Kendrick?" Alistair stepped forward, the alpha aura rolling off him in crushing waves. Several guards nearby dropped to their knees, unable to withstand the pressure. "Are you telling me I cannot smell my own pup?" Kendrick swallowed hard, taking a step back. No, sire. But magic? Potions? There are ways to fool the senses." "Enough!" Alistair cut him off. He didn't yell. The quiet menace in his voice was far worse. "Tobias." The captain of the guard stepped forward, his face grim. "Sire, secure the perimeter. No one leaves this courtyard. Lock down the gates." Alistair ordered, his eyes never leaving Kendrick's pale face. "If this woman was framed, the true traitor is standing among us." Alistair turned back to Rowena. She was still on her knees, shivering so violently her teeth were chattering. The adrenaline that had spiked her wolf's distress signal was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Alistair stripped off his heavy fur mantle. He knelt again and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fur was incredibly warm, holding his body heat and his scent. It swallowed her small frame entirely. Without asking for permission, he slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, lifting her effortlessly against his chest. Rowena gasped, instinctively grabbing handfuls of his leather tunic to steady herself. "Put me down," she ordered weakly. "You're freezing to death, Rowena." He muttered, his jaw tight. "And so is the pup. You didn't care 5 minutes ago." "I didn't know." He looked down at her, his amber eyes tortured. "If I had known, you still would have thought I poisoned you." She countered, her cynical edge returning as the warmth of the cloak seeped into her skin. "You just would have waited until I gave birth to kill me." A muscle ticked wildly beneath the scarred skin of his cheek. He didn't argue with her. He couldn't. She was right. The trust in his court was non-existent, and he had been a paranoid ruler long before the assassination attempt. Alistair turned to the crowd, holding her tight against him. "The execution is cancelled," he announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "The prisoner is now under my direct protection. Anyone who touches her, anyone who speaks a word against her, will answer to me." He didn't wait for a response. He carried her away from the blood-stained block, away from the confused, whispering crowd, and strode purposefully toward the heavy oak doors of the royal wing. Rowena rested her head against his chest. She could hear the rapid, heavy thud of his heart beneath the leather. She was alive. But as the heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the wind and the crowd, she realized she had just traded one prison for another. She wasn't a condemned traitor anymore. She was a vessel, and the dangerous, unpredictable Alpha King holding her would never, ever let her go. The royal chambers smelled of cedarwood expensive beeswax and the stifling heat of a massive stone hearth. Alistair kicked the heavy oak door shut behind them, the latch clicking with a finality that made Rowena's stomach drop. He carried her past tapestries woven with the bloody triumphs of his ancestors, past the gilded armor stands, and deposited her directly onto the center of his massive bed. The mattress was absurdly soft, stuffed with goose down. Her filthy soot-stained tunic smeared grey dirt across the pristine white linen sheets. She didn't care. The ambient heat of the room was hitting her freezing skin like a physical assault, causing her extremities to throb with the agonizing pins and needles of thawing frostbite. Alistair stood by the bed chest, heaving. He looked completely lost. The fearsome Alpha King who had just halted an execution with a single roar was now staring at her raw wrists as if they were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I need to call a healer," he muttered, turning toward the door. "No." The word cracked out of her harsh and definitive. Alistair stopped. "You are malnourished, half-frozen, and your wrists are bleeding." He stated, his amber eyes narrowing. "You need a healer. I need you to stay away from me." Rowena countered. She pulled her knees to her chest, wincing as the movement pulled at her stiff joints. She wrapped his heavy fur mantle tighter around her shoulders. "A healer works for the Crown. The Crown works for Kendrick. If you want this child to survive the night, you won't let anyone with a mortar and pestle within 10 feet of me." Alistair's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. His court was compromised. The rot had spread deep if his most trusted advisor had successfully orchestrated an assassination attempt and framed an innocent woman. He moved to a heavy iron-bound chest at the foot of the bed and threw it open. He pulled out a roll of clean white bandages and a small glass vial of amber liquid. "Then I will do it," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped violently under his weight. Rowena scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the carved wooden headboard. "Don't touch me," she warned. "Rowena." His voice was a low, rumbling vibration. "Your skin is torn. Infection will kill you just as surely as Gregor's axe. Give me your hands." She stared at him. He held his hands out, palms up. They were huge, calloused, scarred from a lifetime of war. These were the hands that had condemned her to the dark. They were also the hands that had pulled her out of it. Slowly, reluctantly, she extended her arms. He didn't grab her. He let her rest her wrists in his palms. His touch was jarringly gentle. He uncorked the vial with his teeth. The sharp medicinal scent of distilled yarrow and thyme filled the air. "This will sting," he warned quietly. He poured the liquid over the raw, broken skin where the iron cuffs had bitten deep. Rowena hissed, her entire body flinching as the alcohol burned into the open wounds. She tried to yank her hands back, but his grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to hold her steady. "Steady," he murmured. "I have you. You don't have me." She shot back, fighting the tears of pain that pricked her eyes. "You have an incubator. Let's not pretend this is an act of compassion, Alistair." He didn't look up from his work. He took the clean linen and began to wrap her wrists with practiced efficiency. "I didn't know you were with child. Would it have mattered?" she asked bitterly. "Would you have spared me if I wasn't you? Looked at the evidence Kendrick handed you and didn't ask a single question. I was the scribe who sat outside your study every Tuesday for 3 years. I reorganized your entire tactical library. I bound the knife wound on your neck." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You didn't even look at me during the trial." Alistair finished tying off the bandage. He finally looked up. The guilt in his eyes was naked raw and completely uncharacteristic for a king. "I remember the dark," he said softly. "I remember the fever. I remember someone holding me, telling me the bleeding would stop. When I woke up, the guards were there. You were gone. Kendrick brought me the wolfsbane found in your quarters, and you believed him. He has been my father's advisor and mine for 30 years. Alistair said flatly. You were a shadow in the library. Well, Rowena said, leaning her head back against the wood and closing her eyes. The shadow is pregnant, and the advisor is a traitor. The world is a funny place. Alistair stood up. Tobias will guard the door. He is the only man in this keep I trust with my life. He will bring you food. Eat it. Rest. He walked towards the door. Where are you going? She asked. Alistair paused his hand on the heavy iron latch. The soft vulnerability that had crept into his demeanor vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal edge of the Alpha King. To hunt. Lord Kendrick did not run. Running was an admission of guilt. Instead, he retreated to his solar, poured himself a goblet of spiced wine, and began calculating the damage. The girl had survived. Worse, she had secured the ultimate shield royal blood. But Kendrick was a pragmatic man. Pregnancies were fragile things in the harsh winters of Oakhaven. Fevers, falls down steep stone stairs, tainted meat accidents happened every day. He needed to maintain his position, deny everything, and wait for his opening. Down in the royal chambers, Rowena refused to sleep. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind was racing. She had eaten half a loaf of bread and a bowl of thick venison stew brought by Tobias, who had tasted it first right in front of her, under Alistair's strict orders. Now she sat at the large oak desk by the window. Alistair had returned hours later smelling of frost and suppressed violence. He had interrogated the dungeon guards. He had torn Kendrick's quarters apart while the man was dining in the great hall. He had found nothing. Kendrick was too smart to leave physical evidence lying around. He's insulated, Alistair said, pacing in front of the hearth. The servant who allegedly found the wolfsbane in your mattress was found dead in the lower town an hour ago. Throat slit. A robbery gone wrong, they say. Rowena stared at the fire. He's cutting loose ends. I can't execute my head advisor without absolute proof. Alistair growled, kicking a stray log back into the flames. The council would rebel. Half the pack alphas in the outer territories are loyal to him. I need evidence of the forgery. Bring me the letters, Rowena said quietly. Alistair stopped pacing. What? The treasonous letters I supposedly wrote to the Moonridge pack. Bring them to me. Rowena, you are exhausted. I am a scribe, Alistair. She snapped, finding her voice, finding her anger. It was better than the fear. I spent my life cataloguing the archive. I know the royal seal. I know the parchment supply. Bring me the damn letters. Alistair stared at her for a long moment. He nodded to Tobias, who stood silently by the door. 10 minutes later, a leather satchel was placed on the desk in front of her. Rowena opened it. Inside were 3 rolled scrolls. She flattened them out, anchoring the corners with heavy iron paperweights. She didn't read the words, the treasonous plots, the detailed maps of the keep's weak points. She didn't care about the content. She cared about the architecture of the lie. She held a candle close to the paper. She ran her fingertips over the dried ink. She studied the wax seal at the bottom. Alistair stood behind her, watching her work. After 20 minutes of absolute silence, Rowena leaned back. A grim, cynical smile touched her lips. Kendrick is arrogant. Explain, Alistair commanded, stepping closer. Rowena pulled a blank sheet of parchment from the desk drawer and a quill. She quickly jotted down a comparison and pushed it toward him. Evidence of forgery, the Moonridge letters. The parchment. These letters are written on pressed sheepskin. Oakhaven scribes use sheepskin for internal ledgers only. Official diplomatic correspondence, even treasonous ones, meant to look official use, vellum imported from the southern plains. I managed the inventory. I never checked out sheepskin for personal use. The ink. Look at the edges of the lettering. She pointed a bruised finger at the curling script. It's browning. Oak gall ink which we use dries pitch black and stays black. This is a cheap charcoal water mix. It smudges when exposed to dampness. The Royal Library banned charcoal ink 2 years ago because it degrades. The seal. The most damning part. This is the Moonridge Wolf and Moon seal. But look at the wolf's tail. Alistair leaned down his cheek, almost brushing her hair. He stared at the red wax. It curls upward. Exactly, Rowena said. The true Moonridge seal features a wolf with a tail tucked down, a sign of defensive posture, an old tradition. The upward curl is a mistake made by someone who read a written description of the seal in a heraldry book, but never actually saw the physical stamp. A book, for instance, located in the restricted section of the library. A section only councilmen have keys to. Alistair's eyes darkened. I can't take this to the council. It's too technical. Kendrick will claim you're lying to save yourself. I know, Rowena said, rolling the scrolls back up. You don't take this to the council, Alistair. You take it to the Moonridge pack. Alistair stiffened. Moonridge is our enemy. Moonridge is your rival. She corrected him. But they are proud. If Kendrick forged their seal to execute an innocent woman and start a border war, the Moonridge Alpha won't be angry at you. He'll be angry at Kendrick for stealing his identity. If you invite their Alpha here under a banner of truce and show him this wax seal, he will tear Kendrick's throat out for you. Alistair stared at her, genuinely stunned. The tactical brilliance of it was flawless. It bypassed the council's politics entirely and weaponized an enemy's pride. He looked down at the bruised, exhausted woman wearing his oversized fur coat. Who are you? He murmured. I was your scribe. She replied, her eyes meeting his without flinching. You should have paid more attention. The castle grew quiet as midnight approached. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thick glass of the chamber windows. Rowena lay in the massive bed. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the heavy metallic scrape of Gregor's axe. She would jerk awake, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. Alistair was not in the bed. He sat in a high-backed leather chair near the hearth, fully dressed, a broadsword resting across his knees. He was staring into the dying embers, his face illuminated by the low orange glow. He hadn't slept either. He was guarding the door, guarding her. You don't have to sit there, Rowena said, her voice quiet in the vast room. Alistair didn't turn his head. Yes, I do. Tobias is outside. Tobias is a good man, Alistair replied softly. But he is not the Alpha. He cannot stop what I can stop. Rowena pushed the heavy-down comforter down to her waist. The room was finally warm. Why did you pull me into your bed that night? The question hung in the air, heavy and sudden. Alistair finally turned to look at her. The shadows deepened the hollows of his face, making him look older, more tired. I was dying, he said, his voice stripped of all its royal authority. The assassin's blade was coated in a synthetic wolf's bane. It was freezing my blood. My wolf was frantic, tearing at my mind, telling me the end was coming. He looked down at his hands. You were there. You were warm. You smelled like paper and old dust and rain. You weren't afraid of the blood. My wolf latched onto you. It wasn't logic, Rowena. It was survival. An instinct to leave something behind before the dark took me. Rowena swallowed hard. The memory of that night was a chaotic blur of fear, pain, and overwhelming, desperate intimacy. I should have run. Why didn't you? Alistair asked, his amber eyes pinning her in place. The guards were gone. The assassin had fled. You could have left me to bleed out. Why did you stay and stitch the wound? Rowena looked away, staring up at the velvet canopy above the bed. Because I know what it is to be discarded, she said bitterly. I was an orphan in the lower town. The scribes took me in because I was quiet and learned to read fast. Nobody cared about me. When I saw you bleeding on that floor, you weren't a king. You were just a man dying alone. I didn't want anyone to die alone. A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of the shrinking fire. Alistair stood up. He walked over to the bed, moving with the silent grace of a predator. He stood beside the mattress, looking down at her. You are not discarded, he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. Not anymore. I am a prisoner. You are the mother of my child. That doesn't make me free, Alistair, she snapped, looking up at him with flashing eyes. It just makes me valuable. What happens when the child is born? What happens when you have your heir? Does the axe come back down? Alistair's expression shattered. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, exactly as he had done in the courtyard. He reached out his large hands, hovering over her, before gently reverently placing them over the blanket, covering her flat stomach. "The axe is gone." He swore, his voice trembling with an emotion so raw it made Rowena's breath catch. "I will burn this castle to the ground before I let anyone touch you again, including myself. I swear it to you, Rowena." He wasn't lying. The Alpha Bond, dormant and unrecognized until the moment of the execution, was bleeding through him now. She could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his devotion pushing against her senses. But cynicism was a hard armor to shed. Before she could answer, a loud, frantic pounding echoed on the chamber door. Alistair was on his feet in a microsecond, his broadsword in his hand, placing himself between the door and the bed. "Sire!" Tobias's voice was muffled through the thick wood, tight with panic. Alistair threw the bolt back and yanked the door open. Tobias stood there, a torch in one hand, his face pale and grim. "What is it?" Alistair demanded. Tobias looked past the king, his eyes locking onto Rowena sitting up in the bed. "It's the kitchen, sire," Tobias said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "The boy who brought the venison stew for the prisoner this evening. We just found him in the pantry. Dead." Rowena's blood ran cold. She looked at the empty wooden bowl sitting on the desk across the room. Kendrick hadn't waited for an accident. He had already made his move. Alistair looked from Tobias to the empty bowl, and the terrifying, murderous roar that erupted from his chest shook the very foundations of the keep. The sound of Alistair's roar was a physical force. It rattled the heavy iron candelabras and vibrated in the marrow of Rowena's bones. Tobias flinched, his hand dropping instinctively to the hilt of his sword. Alistair didn't look at his captain. He whirled around, his amber eyes locking onto the empty wooden bowl sitting on the desk. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides and grabbed the bowl, lifting it to his face. He inhaled sharply. The muscles in his neck strained, cording like thick ropes. "Wolfsbane!" Alistair whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization. "And foxglove?" Tobias stared in shock. "Sire, I tasted it. I swear it on my life. I ate a spoonful before she touched it. The poison wasn't in the stew, Tobias." Alistair snarled, hurling the bowl against the stone wall. It shattered into jagged wooden splinters. It was baked into the bread she used to soak up the broth. Rowena felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling. No, the thought was a fragile, desperate denial, but her body was already answering. A deep, twisting cramp seized her lower abdomen. It wasn't the dull ache of the cold. It was sharp, invasive, and chemical. She doubled over, a wet, ragged gasp tearing from her throat as she clutched her stomach. Alistair was at her side instantly. He threw the heavy fur blankets off her, his large hands gripping her shoulders. "Rowena, look at me." She couldn't. The pain spiked, blinding white and hot, radiating down her thighs. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, instantly chilling her skin. The poison was designed for this. It wasn't meant to stop her heart. It was a targeted abortifacient laced with enough wolfsbane to suppress her body's natural healing abilities. Kendrick didn't need her dead right away. He just needed the royal pup eradicated. The mother dying of internal bleeding afterward would just be an unfortunate side effect. Tobias, Alistair roared over his shoulder. "Get me a knife, a clean one, now." Tobias didn't hesitate. He pulled a silver-hilted hunting dagger from his belt, wiped it fiercely against his own tunic, and handed it to the king. "What are you doing?" Rowena choked out, her vision blurring at the edges, as another violent cramp hit her. "My blood." Alistair said, his voice entirely devoid of panic, replaced by a lethal surgical focus. "The pup shares my bloodline. My regenerative cells are the only thing strong enough to burn out the wolfsbane before it reaches the womb." He didn't wait for her consent. He brought the blade to his own left forearm and sliced down. The cut was deep, brutal, and precise. Dark, thick crimson blood welled up, instantly spilling over his scarred skin. He grabbed the back of Rowena's neck with his right hand, supporting her head, and pressed his bleeding forearm to her mouth. Drink, he commanded. Rowena hesitated, her cynical mind screaming at the metallic raw scent of raw blood. But the agony in her stomach twisted tighter, a physical manifestation of the life being violently ripped away from her. The survival instinct hers, and the wolf's overrode the disgust. She opened her mouth and clamped her lips over the wound. The taste was overwhelmingly metallic, thick and hot. But the moment Alistair's blood hit her tongue, it wasn't just liquid. It was liquid fire. The sheer, unadulterated power of an alpha's undiluted blood hit her system like a lightning strike. She choked, trying to pull away, but Alistair held her firm. "Swallow it," he rasped, his eyes burning into hers. "Take it all. Fight it, Rowena." She swallowed. The blood burned down her esophagus, a localized inferno that hit her stomach, and immediately went to war. She could feel the collision in her veins. The icy, venomous grip of the foxglove and wolfsbane clashed violently with the roaring heat of Alistair's biology. Her back arched. A horrific, guttural scream tore through her clamped lips, muffled against his arm. The pain was absolute. It felt as if someone had poured boiling lead into her pelvis. Alistair didn't let go. He poured his energy, his heat, his very life force down her throat, his own face paling as he forced his regenerative properties to prioritize her body over healing his own arm. "Hold the door, Tobias," Alistair ordered, over the sound of Rowena's ragged breathing. "No one enters. If Kendrick comes, take his head off." "Yes, sire." Tobias drew his broadsword, planting himself firmly in front of the heavy oak door. Minutes stretched into an eternity of agony. Rowena writhed on the bed, her nails digging into Alistair's leather tunic, tearing the stitching. She fought the darkness encroaching on the edges of her vision. She pictured the damp, freezing dungeon. She pictured the axe. She had survived all of that. She refused to be killed by a poisoned crust of bread. Slowly, agonizingly, the burning began to subside. The sharp stabbing cramps dissolved into a deep, throbbing ache. The icy sweat on her skin began to warm as Alistair's blood forced her own circulation to stabilize. Her breathing hitched, slowing from frantic gasps to deep, exhausted pulls of air. Alistair finally pulled his arm away. The deep gash on his forearm was already sluggish, his own healing finally kicking in now that she was safe. Rowena collapsed back against the pillows, wiping a smear of blood from her chin with a shaking hand. She stared at the ceiling, her chest heaving. "Is it?" Her voice was a broken rasp. Alistair leaned over her. He pressed his hand flat against her lower stomach. He closed his eyes, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep, concentrated breath. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then his shoulders dropped. The crushing tension drained from his massive frame. "It's there." He whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he fiercely tried to suppress. "The heartbeat is faint, but it's there. The pup survived." Rowena closed her eyes, a single involuntary tear slipping down her temple into her dirt-matted hair. It wasn't a tear of joy. It was the sheer brutal relief of outliving an execution twice in one day. Alistair took a clean linen cloth from the bedside table and gently wiped the blood from her mouth. His touch was jarringly tender compared to the violence of the last hour. "Sleep now," he said quietly. "The venom is burned out. The bond is set." Rowena looked at him, her eyes heavy. "You fed me your blood. You forced a blood bond." "I saved your life," he corrected flatly. "And I bought us time. But Kendrick doesn't know that. Tomorrow morning he will expect to hear that the traitor miscarried and died of the shock." A cynical, exhausted smile touched the corner of Rowena's lips. "Then we should probably disappoint him." Alistair's eyes darkened, the alpha predator returning to the surface. "Oh, we are going to do much more than disappoint him. Tobias." Tobias turned from the door. "Sire, saddle the fastest horse in the stables. Send a rider to the Moonridge border, under the banner of truce." Alistair stood up, his bloody arm hanging by his side. "Tell Alpha Bram I have a gift for him." 3 days passed. The keep of Oakhaven operated under a suffocating shroud of tension. Rumours bled through the stone walls like damp. The kitchen boy's murder had been swept under the rug by Lord Kendrick as a petty squabble over gambling debts. The Alpha King had locked himself in the royal wing refusing counsel, and the traitor Rowena was allegedly dead, her body burned in the night to prevent the spread of whatever sickness took her. Kendrick had played the game beautifully. He had insulated himself, removed the witnesses, and let the problem solve itself. The king's grief over a lost, mythical pup would fade, and Kendrick would resume his position at his right hand. Then the horns blew. They were not the high, clear notes of the Oakhaven Watch. They were deep, resonant blasts of hollowed bone, the sound of the Moonridge Pack. The great hall was a cavernous space of stone and heavy timber, lit by two massive, roaring fireplaces at either end. The long oak tables had been pushed back, creating a wide, open corridor down the centre. Lord Kendrick stood near the raised dais, adjusting the velvet cuffs of his tunic. He looked calm, but a thin sheen of sweat coated his upper lip. He leaned toward his second-in-command. "Why is Bram here? The king did not consult the council on a parley. They say the king invited him, my lord." The man whispered back nervously. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a deafening crash. Alpha Bram of Moonridge did not walk. He invaded. He was a massive man entirely lacking the refined, dark elegance of Alistair. Bram was built like a siege engine wearing heavy chainmail and furs that smelled of pine needles and wet earth. A thick, braided beard covered his jaw, and a jagged scar crossed over a milky, blind left eye. Behind him marched 6 of his most lethal enforcers. The Oakhaven guards tensed their hands, dropping to their weapons. "Stand down." Alistair emerged from the shadows behind the dais. He wore no crown, only his heavy combat leathers. His amber eyes were cold, calculated stones. He walked down the steps and met Bram in the center of the hall. The two alphas stared at each other. The air pressure in the room dropped. To the betas and common wolves watching, it felt like standing between 2 thunderstorms about to collide. "Alistair," Bram grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "You sent a rider. You mentioned a gift. It had better be worth the march through the freezing mud." "It is," Alistair said evenly. "I offer you a traitor." Kendrick straightened up, a look of profound relief washing over his features. He stepped forward. "Alpha Bram, the king speaks truth. We caught a spy in our ranks a few days ago. She was executed for colluding with your pack. We apologize for the insult she caused." "Shut your mouth, Kendrick!" Alistair snapped, not even looking at his advisor. Bram's one good eye narrowed. "I don't know anything about a spy. If you're playing political games with me, Oakhaven, my men will start breaking furniture. And then bones." Alistair snapped his fingers. The side door near the dais opened. The hall fell into an absolute, deathly silence. Rowena walked out. She wasn't wearing the filthy linen of the dungeon. She wore a heavy gown of dark blue wool trimmed with silver. Her hair was washed and braided tightly against her scalp. She looked pale, the dark circles under her eyes, a testament to her near-death experience, but she walked under her own power. Her posture was straight. Beside her walked Tobias, his hand resting on his sword. Kendrick's face lost every drop of colour. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer hide. "She's alive!" a councilman gasped. Bram looked at the woman, then back to Alistair. "Who is this?" Alistair said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "Is Rowena. She is my mate, and she carries my heir." The collective gasp from the Oakhaven pack was audible. Kendrick looked as if he had been physically struck. Alistair didn't give them time to recover. He reached into his coat and pulled out the leather satchel Rowena had reviewed 3 nights ago. He tossed it onto the heavy oak table in front of Bram. 3 nights ago, my advisor Lord Kendrick presented evidence that Rowena was a poisoner working for Moonridge." Alistair said, his eyes finally locking on to Kendrick. "He brought me letters bearing your seal. He ordered her execution. And when that failed, he sent a kitchen boy to poison her food with foxglove." Bram picked up the satchel. He unrolled the first parchment. He didn't read the words. He looked straight at the red wax seal at the bottom. Rowena stood silently watching the trap spring. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired. But she recognized the brutal necessity of the moment. Bram's massive thumb rubbed over the wax. He stopped. He brought the parchment closer to his one good eye. The silence stretched, pulling tighter and tighter until it felt like it would snap. Bram looked up. The fury in his face was entirely unhinged. It was the pure territorial rage of a wolf whose absolute honor had been mocked. The tail. Bram rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. It curls up. Alistair finished. Bram crushed the parchment in his fist. He turned his massive head, slowly locking his terrifying gaze on Lord Kendrick. My pack sigil is the tucked tail, a defensive stance. Any man who has ever fought a Moonridge wolf knows this. Only a coward sitting in a library reading books would make this mistake. Alpha Bram, I swear to you. Kendrick began, his voice shrill, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. You forged my seal! Bram roared, taking a heavy step toward the advisor. You tried to use the name of Moonridge to murder a pregnant woman and cover your own treason. He is lying! Kendrick screamed, turning to the Oakhaven Council. The king is bewitched. The woman is a witch. She has poisoned his mind. Guards, take her! None of the Oakhaven guards moved. Tobias drew his sword, stepping slightly in front of Rowena. Alistair stepped between Bram and Kendrick. He is my pack, Bram. The kill is mine. Bram stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at Alistair, understanding the ancient pack laws. The Alpha must clean his own house. Bram nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. Take his head, Oakhaven, or I will take yours. Alistair turned to Kendrick. Kendrick realized the game was over. The insulation was gone. The political shields were broken. He lunged backward, drawing a short, hidden blade from his sleeve. I protected this pack for 30 years. Kendrick spat, his composure entirely shattered, revealing the desperate, pathetic creature underneath. Your father was weak. You are weak, letting a filthy lower ward scribe dictate the royal bloodline. I did what was necessary to keep the blood pure. You poisoned a scribe. Alistair said, his voice eerily calm as he drew his broadsword. The steel sang in the quiet hall. You murdered a kitchen boy. You forged documents, and you tried to kill my child. Kendrick lunged, a desperate, wild swing aimed at Alistair's throat. It was a pathetic attempt. Alistair didn't even bother to parry. He stepped to the left, letting Kendrick's momentum carry him forward, and swung his broadsword in a tight, brutal arc. The heavy blade severed Kendrick's right hand at the wrist. Kendrick shrieked, collapsing to his knees on the stone floor, clutching the bleeding stump to his chest. The short blade clattered uselessly away. Alistair stepped over him, looking down at the man who had shaped his entire life. There was no hesitation, no lingering affection for an old mentor. The sentence for high treason, Alistair said, his voice echoing off the rafters, is death. Alistair raised the sword high with both hands. He didn't use an executioner's block. He didn't wait for a priest. He brought the blade down, the sickening thud of steel biting through bone and burying itself into the floorboards echoed through the great hall. Rowena didn't look away. She forced herself to watch. She needed to know it was real. She needed to know the architect of her nightmare was truly gone. As Kendrick's body slumped to the stones, a heavy collective exhale swept through the room. Bram snorted a grim sound of approval. Clean. Alistair stood over the body for a long moment. He wiped his blade on Kendrick's velvet cloak, sheathed it, and turned to the councilmen who were staring at the blood pooling on the stones. Let this be understood. Alistair commanded his voice, leaving no room for argument. The rot in this court has been severed. Lord Kendrick acted alone out of ambition and paranoia. If anyone wishes to dispute my judgment, step forward now. No one moved. Alistair turned back to Bram. The insult to your pack is avenged. Bram nodded slowly. It is. Keep your house in order, King Alistair. I will not march under a banner of truce next time. The massive Moonridge Alpha turned and marched out of the hall, his enforcers trailing behind him like a storm rolling out of the valley. The aftermath was a blur of efficiency. Tobias barked orders having the body removed and the stones scrubbed. The councilmen filed out in absolute silence, heads bowed. Soon the vast hall was empty save for Alistair and Rowena. The adrenaline that had kept her standing began to recede, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. The heavy blue wool of the dress felt like lead. She leaned heavily against the edge of the long oak table, her hands gripping the wood to keep from collapsing. Alistair walked toward her. His boots were stained with blood. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the physical space she had so fiercely guarded since the dungeon. "It's over," he said quietly. Rowena looked at the dark stain soaking into the stone floor where Kendrick had fallen. "Is it? The council knows the truth. The threat is gone. Kendrick was a symptom, Alistair," she said, her voice dry and cynical. She finally looked up at him. "This court is a viper's nest. They bow to you now because they fear your sword. But what happens in a year? What happens when the child is born, and they decide a lower ward scribe isn't fit to be a queen?" Alistair crossed the remaining distance between them. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You are not just a scribe," he said, his amber eyes intensely focused on hers. "You outmaneuvered the smartest politician in the Western Territories from a prison cell. You bled with me. You survived Foxglove. You are the strongest creature in this keep." Rowena looked away. "I'm just surviving. Then survive with me." The raw vulnerability in his voice made her look back. The Alpha King, the man who had just decapitated his mentor without a flinch, was looking at her with a desperate, naked plea. "I know I cannot ask for your forgiveness," Alistair said softly. "I ordered your death. I put you in chains. I will carry that failure until the day I die. But I swore I would burn this castle down before I let anyone hurt you again, and I meant it." He slowly reached out his hand, hovering over hers where she gripped the table. He didn't force the contact. He waited. Rowena stared at his scarred hand. She remembered the cold iron of the execution block. She remembered the freezing wind. But she also remembered the burning heat of his blood, saving her life in the dark. It wasn't a fairy tale. There was no sudden, overwhelming wave of romantic love wiping away the trauma. It was messy, violent, and built on a foundation of terror and survival. But as she looked at him, she saw a man who had ripped his own world apart to fix his mistake. Slowly, carefully, Rowena uncurled her fingers from the edge of the table and turned her hand over. She let Alistair's large, calloused hand close over hers. He exhaled a ragged breath, stepping closer, wrapping his other arm around her back and pulling her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of pine needles' rain and the faint, undeniable scent of their shared bloodline. Rowena rested her head against his shoulder. The heavy, protective weight of the Alpha Bond settled over her mind, pushing back the lingering shadows of the dungeon. They stood alone in the great hall, two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage of a broken court. The executioner's block was empty. The winter wind howled outside the heavy stone walls, but inside the fire was finally beginning to catch. The axe was stopped, the traitor was executed, and Rowena's fight for survival has rewritten the future of the pack. But ruling a kingdom of wolves is never simple, and a crown born in blood requires a heavy toll. Do you think Alistair can truly heal the scars he left on Rowena, or will the ghosts of Oakhaven haunt them forever? If this gritty, grounded werewolf romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share it with fellow dark fantasy lovers. Subscribe for more intense high-stakes storytelling. See you next time.